Welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. Today, my guest is someone who mentored me in my beginning journey, teaching me about the use of writing as a healing tool. And she continues to influence my work with her wisdom. Dr. Sherry Reiter. She is a creative arts therapist and licensed clinical social worker. She is a poetry therapist, mentor-supervisor, and registered drama therapist. She's also board certified trainer for them. A believer in the creative arts for well-being, Sherry has joined many of the boards of leading organizations in the field. In 1984, she received the Outstanding Achievement Award for her pioneering work in creating professional standards in the field of poetry therapy. She also received the 2002 NAPT, that is National Association for Poetry Therapy, Distinguished Service Award. In 2005, she received the Art Learner Pioneer Award for her visionary work in poetry therapy. In 2007, she was recipient of the Morris Morrison Education Award for excellence in teaching and bringing poetry therapy to marginalized populations. In 2009, Touro College honored Sherry as Instructor of the Year. She divides her time between private practice, writing, and teaching. As a consultant for the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, she has been a popular lecturer and workshop leader. Dr. Sherry Reiter is co-author of Twice Chai, A Jewish Road to Recovery. She has also been featured on the Fox News channel as an expert on poetry therapy. Her book, Writing Away the Demons, Stories of Creative Coping Through Transformative Writing, was published in 2009 and is a primer of poetry therapy featuring the stories of clients, students, and colleagues who have written their way through crises. Sherry has been teaching poetry therapy to professionals since 1978, when she began teaching alongside with psychiatrist Dr. Jack Liddy. There is so much more I can say about her, but I'm going to stop here so we can have some time to converse. So welcome, Sherry.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with my former student of more than 20 years ago. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
I'll always be your student, you know that, because you're a wise soul and a brilliant mind. So
thank you.
Tell me, Sherry, when did you first discover there was poetry in words and that poetry was healing? Can you give us your personal account of maybe how poetry has been healing for you?
You know, I was a very big reader when I was a child, and I lived on the top of a hill, and at the bottom of the hill was a library. So I could go to the library every week, and I would come back with as many books as I could carry. So I became this voracious reader. Poetry came later, I would say. By the time I was 17, 18, I had started playing with words. And when I wanted to express something, I would turn to paper and pen. and I have used it throughout my life. I've written about my miscarriage. I've written about depression. Few poems about depression, because when I'm depressed, I don't write. But it's a healing, it's a natural healing tool. And in my work with other people, I have found it to be extremely powerful. And as a clinical social worker, I would say it is the most powerful tool that I have to reach people, whether it's through storytelling or poetry or journaling. So, you know, in the beginning, I was an actress and I used different voices. That was my work. And we know how important it is for people to find their true voice in writing, right? To discover one's own voice is a developmental step in personhood. And that's what we poetry therapists do. We help people to discover their voice, to express their voice, to reclaim their voice when oppressed or constricted.
That is so beautiful, and also important for us to look at what you were saying, how writing and finding one's voice is a developmental step in personhood,
Yes.
in building that personhood. Tell me more about how you got to that place of understanding that. I know that you said you were working with voices as an actress, and what did you begin to see that led you?
I started out in this field actually when I was 17. And my father, who was a refugee from Vienna in World War II, he was struggling to make a living in this country until he scored very high on the civil service exam, and he was given a full scholarship to Columbia University to take a degree in social work. When I was, now my parents were very, very strict, which means, and there are theories about this, that when there are strictures and there are constrictions, there is such a need for the person to express who they are. So I think that was me, you know, so that's why I started writing. But, you know, he was very overprotective, as people from the Holocaust are. And he didn't want me to work during the summer, and I wanted to work. And he had a job at that time as a supervisor for the New York City Department of Aging. So he said, why don't you come in and do some workshops? So I had this unique opportunity. And these senior citizens really became my teachers. I mean, that was my first moment. My first moment was doing a workshop, a writing workshop. And I was doing word association. I was playing with them, then I would give them a theme, and and it was supposed to be recreational writing. But in this one workshop, there was an octogenarian, Olivia, who she was writing furiously for 10 minutes and her hand was trembling. And at the end of it, she came up to me, well, she shared, and what she shared was, all night long, the rain lashed at my window and I was afraid. Then she came up to me. She tapped me on the shoulder. She wiped away a tear. And she said, this was an excellent session. And I was going, what just happened? What happened? It was poetry therapy. I knew it was not recreational therapy. It was something very, very different, because people were moved deeply. And about a year later, a year or two later, no, it was maybe 3 years later, I came across an advertisement for Morris Morrison's course at the New School called Poetry Therapy. And I took it. And 3 years after that, I was teaching it with Dr. Jack Leedy.
Beautiful. I want to go back to what you were saying, that you don't write when you are depressed. And is it because we need kind of a maturation of emotions before we are able to put it down on the page? What is your take on that?
No, it is because in a deep depression, you are shut down. You have stopped. You cannot create. Now, there are all kinds of degrees of depression. And I have one of the only poem actually that I wrote about depression, because I have a friend, a Haitian poet, and he always calls me Cherry instead of Sherry. And so I was in a depression, and he sent me this book of haikus called Cherry Blossoms. And so this poem was written, but it says how I experienced these depressions. Lord, I fear the winter vice closing on my brain. This terrible constriction, oppressive suffocation, the needle with no eye, the singer with no voice, the artist with no hands. How do I keep this terror from the killing ground? By what quirk or curse of fate have I been chanced with this gift of pain? Do blossoms come from the wounded tree? Yes, in spring. See the buds? They come. So my experience, the needle with no eye, the singer with no voice, the artist with no hands, the impotence of, and the paralyzing force of depression, I really think that captures for me how I experienced this. And I was very moved when he sent me this little book of poems and said, in the spring, there will be blossoms.
So that's what I'm thinking, Sherry, that there is this degree of separation that has to happen from the emotions in order for us to be able to portray them in words. And I'm thinking, yes, depression is a shutdown kind of situation for us. No matter the degree, it is a sense of separation. It's like trauma, right? Like it's the belief that we are alone and that there is no voice there.
And I think it's a very interesting point, Marianella, because when my friend reached out to me, I was so touched that I unlocked in that moment because he's a poet, and I wanted to respond to him in poetry. So that separation came because there was the insertion of another, and I was not alone in that moment.
Exactly. So I think this is a good segue into talking about your creative writing center, which you said in one of your blogs. It is not just a catchy phrase. And you talk there about there is a self-writing mechanism that you teach. Can you tell us more about that? That is
So the Creative Writing Center, which is supposed to be a tree with a strong spine, balancing, okay? And we lose our balance when we have megadoses of emotion. We can become dysregulated, whether it's from sorrow, from anger, even joy can dysregulate and throw the balance off. And yet in each of us, there is this push, this innate wanting to be healthy, wanting to be well, the push toward growth, like a grass that just comes up if there's enough sunlight and if there's enough rain. And we are always striving for that homeostasis. And sometimes we need to insert that something, and that can be a good therapist. It could be a good poem. It could be a poem that lets us know, as Lady used to say, that we are not alone, and the poem becomes a friend, an understanding someone. I suffer, says the man, not you alone, says the poem.
Exactly. And it is that concept that Thich Nhat Hanh spoke so often about, the process of interbeing, of us being in interrelation with everything that exists. And that when we disconnect from that notion of belonging, to the other as the other belongs to us, that's when we go into depression. That's when we go into that sense of isolation that you were talking about. So the writing mechanism is a getting in touch kind of mechanism, getting in touch within and getting in touch outside, you will say. Right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
It's connecting to the inner landscape of yourself. Now, imagine, here we are in the jet age, and we're rushing here and we're rushing there, and then loneliness has become a #1 issue for Americans. That 3 out of 4 Americans, I believe it is, say that they feel lonely. Well, then you have lockdown, and I just heard on the radio that for women between 2019 and now, addiction has risen 100%. 100%. We know suicide rates have gone up. To be alone and to be disconnected is leading us to tragedy. And we have to find the antidotes to this loneliness, to this disconnection. And poetry therapy is a marvelous, marvelous tool to help us to connect inside and outside to others.
And what do you think makes poetry specifically that such a conduit for that process of connecting? Why do you think that is? That poetry, we do use fragments of stories and other genres, but when we use it is because they are charged with poetry. So what is so particular about poetry that allows us to do this?
I think that poetry is primal, that it goes back to our roots, when it goes back to the deepest beginnings of man. And accordingly, when I have looked it up, even 500,000 years ago, when humans lived in caves, that they danced, the archaeologists and anthropologists tell us they danced around the fireplace and they chanted and they envisioned what they wanted to come into being. It was a form of prayer or ritual. They used substances also to heighten their consciousness, but they we believe they saw in pictures before we had speech. Now, the chanting is, again, it's going to use metaphor, which is tied with imagery, which is tied to, again, this very early development of our beings. And the ability to step outside of our everyday prose into this magic where things don't always make sense in the linear way, gives validity to the other world, the world that we know exists, but is hidden in our everyday behaviors.
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
It's important to acknowledge that other world. The world, yes, where do we go when we're sleeping, when we're dreaming? And who's to say that this world is more real than that world?
Mm-hmm. Right. And you were describing what we know as indigenous wisdom, which is that embodiment and that communion, that connection with the earth and the body at all times. And it's actually not in the past. It's still here. And the indigenous wisdom is the hope for healing and progression of the world. The older line of thinking has almost killed this world. and we are relying actually and thankfully going back to remembering that which has always been there. In that, in that sense, when you think about the writing mechanism that you offer, can you give us a sense of what your interaction is with a person? Let's say a person who comes to you after a shutdown. Let's say someone who has been feeling lonely in the pandemic. What will be the process for you to get the person to access the writing mechanism? What are the process of facilitation for you?
Well, the first thing is just listening, is attunement. Mm-hmm. That I am really actively listening with 3 ears, or as you say, the ears of the heart.
Yeah.
Right. And as I'm listening, I listen very carefully. And sometimes the person themselves gives me a clue. And if I hear a line that sounds like a poem, I will say, wait a second, I just heard something that was very poetic. Okay. I am a phoenix, but I am still in the ashes, unrisen. That sounds like the first line of a poem. Would you be open to playing with this a little bit? And then we take that first line, and I work collaboratively if the person is very shut down. So I supply a line, and then I may ask a question to elicit the next line from the person. But sometimes the person will then start to just talk, and I become the scribe. And then I read it back, and then we discuss it. We explore it a little deeper. And so the important thing here is that I'm joining with the person, and then we're both looking at what has been created, the poesis, I think they call it, something that came out of nothing. And there is such a feeling of, if we've if it's accurate, there is such a feeling of relief and release
Mm.
and the beginning of acceptance from the person.
Which moves the person then, um, from loneliness into being able to see the beauty in solitude. Because most of us write in solitude, right? And it's that replenishing the place of richness, of being alone, that's very different from the loneliness that leads to depression, right? So you accompany, poetry therapy is an accompanying the person to kind of remind them
Yeah.
that there is a voice and there is a self there that has a lot to express.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a validation,
Mm-hmm.
strong validation of what they have been feeling. But again, if there's a little bit of hope,
Mm-hmm.
just like in my depression poem, but see, in the spring, the blossoms come. And if it's, and very often it comes from the person.
I will say all the time it comes from the person, right? The blossoming is coming from them.
Ultimately it does, but it may not come in that session,
Right.
depending on where they are. Yeah.
It's a process. And, going back to what you were saying about the indigenous wisdom, that it is the journey to the heart, right? That the person takes. And sometimes it's taken through movement until we access the language of the heart, which is the non-linear language that you were describing, what we can call even magic, because it's ineffable. Sometimes it's hard to describe, right? But it brings aliveness into the person's experience.
So there's a saying, words from one heart go directly into the heart of another.
Mm-hmm.
And if the person cannot create, which sometimes there is word poverty, or the person is in such an emotional state, they might not be able to. We are going to bring the poem in, and we will choose carefully a poem to lift the spirit of the person. And again, because words from one heart go directly into the heart of another, the words of the poet are going to permeate. And then we're already inside. It doesn't take long to open the doors of the heart if we have the right tools. And poetry is definitely music, poetry, art, all of these, dance, but poetry knocks on the door of the heart.
Yes. So poetry aids us by getting in touch with our thoughts and emotions, regulates our feelings, and express what we're going through. That's kind of, so what is the role of the body in all these? How has neuroscience changed your work? I know you recently participated in the healing trauma through conscious embodiment that was centered on the body's wisdom. So tell us about your contribution there, and how, again, the last 100 years, neuroscience has been evolving and giving us a different understanding of knowing, right? That is not just mind knowing, but there is body knowing. So tell us about your participation in the healing trauma through conscious embodiment.
We poets have always known that poetry initiates and is part of the healing and transformational processes. So my understanding was more on the inside of the body, chemistry biology, it's in our blood, it's in our neurotransmitters, that this metaphor, which we understand, which actually means to carry across and we understand. So when you say my love is like a red, red rose, we are carrying X equals Y, okay? One is literal and the other is figurative. Now we know that in metaphor, the whole brain is lighting up because we're starting on one side of the brain, then it's traveling past over the corpus callosum and going to the other side. We understand that when we work with imagery, it begets more imagery. There are neurotransmitters that flood the system, that biology is involved. Our heart rate can change, our blood pressure changes. And, you know, in drama therapy, we sometimes act out a poem, but many poems are not for acting out. So I don't do that often. I'm really only starting to learn about this concept of embodiment. I know that you have done workshops on writing as an embodied, you know, and bringing the body in to our writing. But I am more concerned with how the inside, the biology, the chemistry, that we know that once we have a metaphor, it is like a dustpan in a way that sweeps in all of the memories and associations and other images and information, which is why poetry therapy can be so helpful to even populations like dementia and Alzheimer's. So I'm a beginner when it comes to embodiment, but I was talking there about poetry and ritual and ceremony, and I do believe this is a primal and elemental force that goes back to our roots, and it is deeply needed. Rudyard Kipling has this great saying, "I am by trade a dealer of words," and words are, of course, the most powerful drug used by humans. So the other thing is this, I'm looking at poetry. You know, one of my works is The Soul Savant, Your Ninth Sense. And I'm bringing that in because we know about the five senses, but I am naming a ninth sense. And that ninth, I just want to go over this. There are five senses. If you touch your nose with if you're able to do that because of your sixth sense, proprioception. And the seventh sense is vestibular, which is balance. And the eighth sense is regulatory, that tells you when you're hungry, when you need to sleep. So I am naming the ninth sense, your poetic sense, is enhances all the other senses and helps you to make sense of and meaning of, and is connected to the soul, to make sense of everything that your other senses are taking in. Okay, so I call it the ninth sense. And so what poetry brings us is this connectedness to the universe that we are in creation and creation is in us. And if we embrace that, again, we are connected to the universe. We are part of a larger universe. This is a mystery. And Joseph Campbell said, you know, having studied all the different cultures, that, and Jung and him were in agreement. This is one large mystery, and we are all a part of it, and we are all connected to each other. And certainly the poem, which goes from one soul to another soul, often through time and space, is a connection that lets us know, oh, we are all part of this larger creation. And then we are not alone.
So I'm sort of visualizing this ninth sense as an umbrella from which all these other senses are then can be expressed. So the language of the body can be expressed through the ninth sense, that is poetry. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But there has to be that that it's a two-way conversation between all these senses.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really. I'm so glad that you are clarifying it that way, because it is true. Not many. I mean, I've been working with embodied writing for the last 20 years, but there is so much to still explain and do and make it more accessible to people. I think what you are saying about the ninth sense is a good frame to put it. Now, let's see if we talk a little bit about trauma. And within trauma, I include grief. I'm thinking the work that you did in writing away the demons, how you invited all these people to come and illustrate ways in which writing is a tool of psychological survival. Can you say more either about what led you to the compilation, or what was the thing that you learned the most about trauma and grief through working on that book?
Well, the first thing that I learned in doing poetry therapy is how, we, in the intensive workshops where people tell their stories, it was amazing to hear the stories and realize how many people have endured traumas and losses and childhoods of multifaceted trauma and attacks and rapes, and how adaptable human beings are, how we keep going, how we survive. So I'm fascinated by surviving, the survival, the Homo adaptus. We are also Homo narrans, which means the storytelling human. And depending on what story we tell ourselves, but after hearing one of the most terrible stories that I heard, I was very inspired and asked one of the poetry therapy trainees if she would write her story. She said she would. And so that became one of the stories in the book, but that was the inspiration. I wanted the actual writings that helped the person And I also wanted in their own voice for them to tell their story.
Mhm.
And so we have, 13 different individuals, you know, and whether they are coming out of domestic violence or a mood disorder, or they are coming to terms with aging, or they are a pregnant teenager that
Mhm.
hides their abortion. These stories are, about the human condition and struggling, and how people wrote and kept writing to try to exorcise the demon
Mhm.
that was hurting them.
And demon, that demon most of the time is silence, right?
The demon could be silence. The demon could be, as in the Greek idea of demon daemon, Daemon, which was a teaching guide.
Mhm.
I think this life gives us many difficult challenges, and like a coal being brought into becoming a diamond, we are either crushed, or we become who we are through the struggles and the traumas.
Yeah, and again, thanks to the work of neuroscience, we are learning that we are actually wired for not just for connection, but for survival. Like it is in us, and that's why the work is turning more towards this post-trauma growth as opposed to staying in the darkness of the situation. You going back again to the indigenous wisdom of telling, and you just mentioned, the power of storytelling. It's embedded in indigenous wisdom, in African wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So in facilitating healing through writing and storytelling, you have worked with different populations. What has allowed you to navigate the different cultures? What is the language that has allowed you to navigate the different cultures in the work that you do?
That's a hard one to answer, because
Mhm.
I bring myself, I
Mhm.
bring my heart, I try to connect, and I'm genuine. I want to help.
Mhm.
And I think that, when I used to visit Dr. Leedy's practice, and Dr. Leedy worked with methadone, and had a lot of former criminals.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
I was this nice Jewish girl coming in, and I was young. I was like 21, and, wholesome Pollyanna. And I was amazed that I could communicate, and they accepted me. And I don't, I can't, I've gone into addiction centers. I've worked with prisoners. I think if your heart is in the right place, and you want to do good things, and you mean well, people know that. It doesn't matter from which walk of life or from which culture. And
Mhm.
I also try when I can. I had someone I had someone brought me their mother from Africa,
Mhm.
and she was in deep grief from multiple losses, and and she didn't speak English very well, but I knew an African chant,
Mhm.
And I started to dance with her and we chanted together. And it did something.
Mhm.
Certainly not
Mhm.
therapy in the usual mode. I talked to
Mhm.
her as well, and her daughter translated, but it was necessary for me to speak in her language.
Mhm. Mhm.
And thank goodness I
Yeah.
on chant.
Right, right. And thank to the God and goddesses that you have learned to speak the language of the heart, because that is the Esperanto, that is the language spoken by everyone. But in that line, though, and I know you don't represent the movement of poetry therapy, but you're a pioneer in the field of poetry therapy, which has been a movement in this country that has mostly been led by white individuals. What do you think is taking, what are your thoughts about the slow, in my view, the slow coming of inclusivity in the organization, in the poetry therapy movement? Because what you're saying, that yes, it's wonderful that by having that person come to you, and because you know the language of the heart, and because you are the person you are, you knew how to connect. And I remember when I first contacted you in the late 90s that I said to you, my English is kind of, and you were so warm and so welcoming, and you said something like, well, I know some Spanish, so between my Spanish and your English is better than my Spanish. So there was a connection there that said to me, yeah, this is a safe place, right? So I know that the Sherrys of the world are opening, are embracing. And at the same time, we have this issue of, a movement that has benefited from indigenous and African wisdom, that is primarily led by white individuals. So what do you think is sustaining that slow, or causing the slow movement towards more inclusivity?
Uh, I'm not sure about that. I can only tell you that poetry therapy, the association has been a small group for the past 40 years. It has not, been growing by leaps and bounds, to my great disappointment.
Mhm.
Um, I I can't I can't speak to that. I have half of my trainees are Black. I, you know, so I am, you were our president, the National Association for Poetry Therapy. Barbara Bethea was our president, and that she's the Africana Madonna. Um, um, we welcome people from all places. I don't think that people are. Uh, I I'm
Do
not.
you agree with me that it is, like what you were saying, the organization has remained small,
Yeah,
and I'm puzzled by that, right? And I think it is important that we look into that. And I'm not holding you, Sherry Reiter, responsible for that. I'm just saying, um, I'm curious as what your thoughts are about what's sustaining this slow movement towards,
I don't know.
expansion.
I think I know that we give the National Association for Poetry Therapy is giving scholarships to
Mhm.
diverse minorities. I know that there is that the last two the the three events that have been planned, following in your footsteps, have been really with a focus on social justice and diversity. And I credit you for setting us on that path. But there are many issues we haven't focused on poetry therapy for the disabled. We haven't focused on poetry therapy for the incarcerated. We have diversity and transsexuality and gays, lesbians, etc. Queer poetry. I don't think should be stuck on one alone. We have to pay attention to everyone, and there are poets from many different countries that I would love to see speak up. But this is a voluntary organization, and you have the same people, the same people who do the work, and sometimes the people burn out, and it's really just remained small.
Yeah, so that is part of the problem. Yeah, part of the problem is
and
that.
as with all organizations, politics plays a role. It always does. And having been on different boards, I can tell you that I've seen many different arguments and dethronings and fights and different viewpoints. Just like in churches and synagogues, there are these conflicts.
Yeah. But it is part of what you were saying right at the beginning of giving voice. And I mean, I'm asking you this question because you are that person who is inclusive, who has created safe spaces for people from all walks of life to come to you. So it is inspired by my experience working with you that I'm asking the question. Yeah.
I do think, though, that the poetry therapy organization, as opposed to the art therapists or dance therapists or music therapists, have a big disadvantage. And this might be a key point, not having to do with diversity, but all of the other arts therapies have art therapy or dance therapy or drama therapy as their chief professional identity, whereas we do not. We have psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, recreation therapists, librarians. And so that main push and drive to make the organization is not primary in most people's lives, because everyone likes to use poetry, literature, stories, and films. So they fold it into their work. That doesn't mean they're a bibliotherapist.
Right.
But we are at a disadvantage.
Yeah. There is so much more we can say about that. Maybe I need to have you back for a conversation, a wider conversation. But as we close, what are some words of wisdom that you want to share with individuals who might be seeking into bringing poetry therapy to expand their tools and their ability to offer healing? What are some last words of wisdom that you want to share?
Study. Study. I'm teaching now poetry therapy techniques course. I have a teachable platform where I have poetry therapy in the treatment of a trauma survivor. I have Thunder and Lightning, which is about anger and forgiveness. If I also have, and this is a totally free resource, if anyone is interested, I did a workshop, which was a suicide prevention workshop. and deals with depression. I also did a workshop called Only Lonely Me. And if you want to see that video, you can write to me and I will send you the link. Okay. And my email is info at the creative, RIGHT, writing, RIGHTING, center.com. And I will send you the links, which you can use right now. It is free. And if you have anyone who is depressed or who is dealing with loneliness, it has exercises while you are in the workshop. And I am happy to serve as a resource to anyone who is interested in poetry therapy. This is a marvelous, marvelous tool for connection, for personal development and transformation, and meeting the challenges of this crazy and absurd life that we are right now living. So please contact me if you have any questions. And I'd like to end actually with poetry slows us down, centers us. It is a time shifter. It puts us into what Csikszentmihalyi said was flow.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
I love these two lines, so I'm going to end with this from William Blake. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour.
Beautiful.
We can shift time and space.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Good way to close this conversation for now. I hope to have you back so we can expand on those things. And I hope that the listeners take advantage of the opportunity. I know there is a particular class that's going to be starting soon, where you go in details about the writing mechanism of implementing poetry therapy. So I hope people are going to take advantage of that. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor and also YouTube and other platforms. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And if you find our program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion always, always, always.